Welcome everyone. We are so delighted to have you with us tonight at the Vision Australia Library in conversation with Richard Fidler for the Melbourne Writers Festival. As we begin this evening, we take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're gathered here, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, recognising their rich history over tens of thousands of years as the original storytellers of this land. Oral storytelling is so important to the Vision Australia Library, and we are committed to the telling of First Nations stories, as well as supporting the traditions of oral storytelling. My name is Leanne Sajadi, and I'm a librarian and the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Vision Australia Library. Vision Australia is Australia's leading service provider for people living with blindness and low vision. Our library service is a national public library service for people, Australians living with a print disability. We open up a world of books and learning in accessible audio, braille and digital formats. And along with the Vision Australia radio network, we support a wonderful community of readers, listeners and writers across the country, engaging with storytelling and sharing their own stories. Later in the evening, we'll share with you one of the ways that we're bringing stories from our community to the Australian public. But for now, it's fantastic to welcome some of our members and volunteers here with us tonight at Kooyong, as well as joining us online via live stream. So it's tradition when we gather at Vision Australia to describe the space in which we're meeting. There are over 100 of us here tonight at Kooyong in this conference room. Our audience is seated and facing the stage on which Richard and Astrid are sitting. I am speaking at a lectern, and behind me there is a Vision Australia banner. A tiny bit of housekeeping. Please check that your phones are on silent. Our bathrooms are through the corridor behind me to the right. Please keep walkways clear and tuck any belongings under your chair. There will be some photos taken through the evening, so if you prefer not to have your photo taken, please let us know. And if you do need any assistance, please speak with any of our volunteers or staff here tonight. We're wearing the yellow lanyards, or just raise your hand and we'll come and approach you. So following this evening's conversation, there'll be an opportunity for questions and then to have your books signed. Northern Books from Castlemaine are with us tonight, selling a wide selection of Richard's titles. I'm now delighted to introduce Richard Fidler and Astrid Edwards. Richard Fidler is a master storyteller and broadcaster. He's the author of the best-selling books The Golden Maze and Ghost Empire, and co-author of Sagaland. He presents one of Australia's most beloved radio programs and podcasts, Conversations, where he shines a light on stories from all corners of Australia. His latest book, the focus of tonight's conversation, The Book of Roads and Kingdoms, was recently awarded Indie Nonfiction Book of the Year and is available in the Vision Australia Library, beautifully narrated by Richard himself. Astrid Edwards is a prolific reader, writer, reviewer and contributor to the Australian literary scene. She hosts the Garrett Writers on Writing podcast, where she has interviewed more than 200 of Australia's most prominent writers. She's also the former chair of the Melbourne Writers Festival. Please join me in welcoming Richard and Astrid.
Thank you.
Good evening and thank you all for being here, and hello to everybody who is watching on the live stream. Richard, it is a delight to see you again. You've written 4 works of history. Why is history still important to all of us?
I think without history, we're all orphans. I think without history, we are stranded in the boring old present. I mean, what's the first question we sort of want to know when we're kids? It's like, where do we come from? Who's our mum and dad? Who are the people that came before us? I grew up in a household where my dad loved history, and we had all these history books on the wall of our living room, which always looked to me like would contain the secrets of the universe if I was old enough to actually read them and find out what was inside of them. because I always wanted to know, I suppose, like my dad and like my kids do, which is where I fit as this tiny little speck of a human being with a small lifespan in the huge, great flood tide of events in human beings that roll across the centuries, and how this world that we live in, that we sort of are surrounded by, came to be. There's a wonderful quote from Winston Churchill, who was once asked why he was obsessed with writing history, and he said, quite rightly, I think he said, because the further you can see back, the further you can see forward. I don't know if that's always true, but I think it's certainly helpful, because you do have a sense when the Trumps of this world come along, you go, oh, here we go again. This isn't good, is it? So that's history for me. It's the larger story. It enlivens my imagination and gets me excited.
As I've read all of your books, and I have them sitting here, my copies beside us.
The Tower of Astrid's books, yes.
Oh, the Tower of Richard's writings. As I read your books, I feel they all reverberate between each other. And I tried to write a description of your newest book, and I failed. So for those who haven't yet read this book, can you give a very brief introduction, very brief, Richard, so we can dive in to the individual bits?
Sure. It's the Book of Roads and Kingdoms is about the travellers who went out of medieval Baghdad in the early Middle Ages, when Baghdad was the richest and most powerful city in the world and the capital of the biggest empire that the world had ever known. It was also the most cultured city in the world, even more so, it has to be said, I think, it's arguable, but than Chang'an in China at the time, and more so than Constantinople at the time as well. It was incredibly wealthy, it was incredibly literate, people were mad for travel, people were mad for books, and they were mad for books about travel. And so I've got stories here of travellers who went out of medieval Baghdad feeling like the world was their oyster, that God had granted them dominion over the whole world, and they went north, south, east, and west out of the four gates of Baghdad to the far reaches of the world, and came back and wrote accounts of their adventures and the things they discovered and the things they saw in far off lands, from Russia to China to Southeast Africa to Europe as well.
So you just mentioned north, south, east, west. That is how you have structured the majority of the book. And at the beginning of every section, there is a map. And as I was considering the vast geography of the stories and travelers that you have brought to life, it is absolutely huge. And I wanted to kind of interrogate this a little bit, Richard, because normally when people write history, it might be through chronology, it might be the idea of a great man in history, and you have taken a completely different approach.
Yeah, I came into this by finding, I was, during COVID, that was the last time I think I spoke to you, Astrid. We were both doing interviews via Zoom and for the Gareth, and it was wonderful, except that we couldn't be face to face. And I was going to write another book altogether, which would have required me to travel quite a lot, and then we couldn't travel, none of us could. So I thought, write about medieval travellers. I thought, oh, let's look at the Vikings again, not really wanting to really do that, given I talked about the Vikings quite a lot in Sagaland. And then I found an account, and it's the only account we have, a first-hand account of a Viking human sacrifice that took place in modern-day Russia on the Volga River, and it was observed by a Muslim traveller by the name of Ibn Fadlan. He was there, sent on a mission from his caliph in Baghdad, a diplomatic mission which all went horribly wrong. He wrote an account of his journey out there, which is like a really sort of horrifying and amusing at times, Heart of Darkness type narrative of leaving Imperial Baghdad, going through these frozen badlands, and then arriving at the Volga River near Kazan in Russia. And while he's there, a group of Viking traders came into the area, and the chieftain died, and he witnessed a sacrifice, a voluntary sacrifice of a slave woman, which is one of the most hair-raising documents I've ever encountered in all my reading of history. One of the most frightening and weirdest things I've ever read in my life. And as I read this, I thought, I don't want to write about the Vikings. I want to write about more people like Ibn Fadlan, because I loved Ibn Fadlan so much.
So you introduced that, Richard, by saying I found this account of. How on earth do you just find an account of a Viking human sacrifice from a medieval Islamic scholar?
Well, happens to us all once in a while, doesn't it? I don't know. I've become reasonably adept at sort of burrowing into some obscure libraries on the internet and finding all sorts of documents in translation. When I wrote Ghost Empire, my first book, which is a kind of a plotted history of Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire, there's accounts of like the Arab siege of Constantinople in the early 8th century. And to my shame, I thought, I know there are probably a couple of Muslim accounts of the same thing, but there's probably not much. They're probably like the Persian accounts. They're all destroyed by the Mongols and what have you. Oh my God, there are all these accounts. The Abbasid Arabs wrote these extraordinary, voluminous accounts of their travels around the world and of their history. I found the 34-volume history of the world written by the Muslim scholar Al-Tabari in the 10th century. 34 volumes, all of it in translation, all of it, because it's so old, you can get it for free from all sorts of library references. I found this account by Ibn Fadlan in an old Penguin classic, which had a whole lot of similar stories of other travelers going through the Middle Ages. And Ibn Fadlan's one completely stood out, just sort of leapt right out at me. So yeah, I just have these ways of burrowing into the internet and finding this stuff.
Very unexpected. Now, all of your books, Richard, the history, but the art of the period, the poetry, the literature of the period are all part of your research and part of what you publish. And I wanted to ask, before you do a reading for us, what is that nexus between literature and poetry and history?
I think all of it I think the history and the literature and the poetry and the art all talk to each other and reveal different aspects of the time. I'm also really interested in the mythology of the time, the ghost stories, the myths and legends, the folk tales, because I think they reveal the underlying anxieties and desires of the medieval world in particular, but also I kind of just enjoy them for their own sake, like the 1001 Nights or 1001 Arabian Nights. I'm sure a lot of people here have encountered that over the years in one form or another, even if by watching the Disney animated movie of Aladdin. Those stories, they just make the imagination fire and tingle and reveal something about that world. So I think they all talk to one another. And real historical figures appear in these stories, as they do in the 1001 Nights, like the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who appears as the Caliph in so many of the 1001 Nights stories. He was a real historical figure. Quite different from the Harun al-Rashid that's in the 1001 Nights, but a real figure nonetheless.
So will you grace us with a reading?
Yeah, I'd love to. This is, I think when you write a book, you always try and find an opening line that pleases you, and I'm pretty pleased with this one. I don't think I've ever been able to find a better opening line. I don't know if I ever will again. This is the very beginning of my book, and it's from a letter I found written by my favorite of these travelers and scholars. It was a scholar from the 10th century called Al-Masudi. Masudi I loved because he wrote this wonderful book of his travels around the world and of Arabic history called, there's these beautiful titles of these books. His book is called Meadows of Gold and Mines of Gems. Isn't that a beautiful title? Isn't that gorgeous? And finding his book in translation was just a joy in lockdown to feel the presence of this man who was the best traveled man of his time. He'd been all the way down the east coast of Africa. He'd been to Constantinople. He'd been to China. He'd been to India. He'd been to Sri Lanka. He'd seen so much of the world. And he wrote this book. And the book is one thing, but then I also found a translation of a letter he wrote, which I loved, which contains a potion for invisibility. So I'd like to read that for you. This is how you become invisible. Anyone can do this. First, you must find a dead cat. The animal must have already died from old age or from some misadventure. You must not slaughter one for this purpose. Carefully remove the dead cat's head and hollow out its eyes. Then take it to a patch of ground in a place where no one's likely to visit. Dig a hole. The hole should be as deep as the distance from your elbow to your fingertips. Put some dung at the bottom. Then place the cat's head inside the pit so that it faces up to the sky. Now you must do this. In both eye sockets, place a castor oil seed. Then fill the rest of the hole with dung and pat it down. Sprinkle a handful of fine dirt around the edges in a circle, then place a round stone on top. No one must see you do this. Every day, for the next 30 days, you must irrigate the site with blood. This should be procured from a bloodletter. Again, no creature should be harmed. If after 40 days there is a shoot from the soil, good. If not, continue watering it with blood for 60 days. If it sprouts, good. If not, then continue watering it in this manner for 70 days. If not, then for 90 days. Tell no one of this. After a time, 1 or 2 plants may grow. When they begin to bear fruit, and this is crucial, you must not let the fruit fall from the tree to the ground. Instead, carefully harvest some seeds from the pods. This should be done while the moon is waxing and not waning. It's a pretty specific recipe, as you can see. Then you must climb up to a high place, like a rooftop, and sit there with the seeds in your lap. To your left, there must be a 14-year-old boy on the cusp of puberty. To your right, there must be another 14-year-old boy who is also not yet a man. Put one of the castor oil seeds in your mouth, then turn to the boy on your left and ask, "Do you see me?" If the boy says yes, then turn to the boy on your right, taking care not to lose your balance, and ask, "Do you see me?" If he also says yes, then throw away the seed, place another one in your mouth. Now repeat this process with each of the seeds until you find the one seed that, when placed in your mouth, will make both boys answer no. They will likely say this with some astonishment. Carefully place this special seed inside a signet ring concealed under a jewel. Wear it on your finger. Then, whenever you wish to avoid someone in the marketplace, put the ring in your mouth and disappear. Many people have done this and succeeded. Now, there's 2 things I really like about this. The first thing I like about this potion is that what you essentially have here is the ring of power, like from Lord of the Rings. It can make you invisible. And do you use it to sort of like challenge the might of Sauron? No, you will use it to avoid Barry in the marketplace because Barry's so boring and you don't want to run into him. Oh, there's Barry, pop it in my mouth, I'll disappear. And the second thing I think, my view on this, Astrid, was that I think this is actually a prank. I think Masudi is having his friend on here in the letter, and I think the key to this is, he says, you're not to kill a cat. You're not to get blood from an animal. It has to be from a bloodletter. It already has to be spilled. He wants no animal harmed in the making of this prank. This intent he has to get his mate to sit on top of a rooftop and ask a couple of kids, "Do you see me? How about now? Am I invisible yet? Am I invisible yet?" So that's one of the things I loved about Masudi.
That brings me to my next question. As you are uncovering these stories, these potential pranks and jokes, as someone living and writing in the 21st century, it's a long distance to a millennia ago. How do you navigate, different humor, and what makes you so sure that's a prank? I mean, I think it is, but
it's just a suspicion. I think there used to be said about the Romans, the ancient Romans, is that 90% of them we completely recognise. And I think this is true of the Vikings as well. 90% of everything they do you completely recognise. They're governed by the same human impulses that we all have. But the 10% that's left is so completely alien, and it's very, very hard to get our heads into that, if not, in fact, it's impossible, really. And I think you just have to accept that and acknowledge that. I think part of writing history is to understand your limitations as a 20th century writer. There are places you really can't go, so it's best not to be too bloody judgy about things, because you just don't fully know. You can be I think you have to bring some discernment to things and some intuition to things. It feels like a prank. It's so funny. I think that's part of it. That's really part of it. But like I say, there's still that part of that world that is unrecognizable to us. And I think the biggest difference between the medieval mindset and our mindset is that, and this is true for Christians and Muslims and Jews as well to some degree in that world, is that there's this kind of web of causation with everything. It's God that wills everything that happens. And for example, if the city of Constantinople survives the siege of the Arabs, they thought it was because of the Blessed Virgin Mary, not because of their technical ingenuity in building these ships with Greek fire, this kind of petroleum-like flammable substance that they spewed and burnt the opposition navy down with. And if you said, if you could meet them somehow and you'd say, no, it's not the Blessed Virgin Mary that helped you win the siege, it's because your own ingenuity in coming up with this technology. And they'd say, yes, but who gave the idea, who planted the idea in my head? Who gave us access to those resources? Who put the Arabs in the sea just in the way? So it was God, everything is according to God's will, and that is both a joyful thing, but also it's an agony when things go badly wrong.
One of the other distances, apart from time and that 10% that is different, is language. English is your first and only language?
A bit of French, that's about it.
What areas of the past could you not access because there aren't translations yet, or there aren't translations into English? And how did you navigate your way through finding what interests you and what makes this story beautiful, given that...
My Arabic ain't great.
No.
It's non-existent, in fact. The main limitation, I think, of lacking Arabic that presented to me was being able to read the Quran properly. I can only read it in translation. I know, and it's commonly thought that it's a masterpiece of the Arabic language that's meant to be read in Arabic and understood in Arabic, which is why it's always preached in Arabic. It sounds beautiful, it just works, and I don't know how successfully it translates. So I don't think there was, and the Quran is a profoundly, it's an extraordinary document. It's not like the Bible at all. It's not full of stories. There's a couple of stories there, but really it's like, it really does feel like the word of God insofar as things are described and things are spoken of from like 1,000 points of light in the sky somewhere. It seems to exist out of time. It's quite an extraordinary book, and I think the translation into English, it struggles to present itself in all of its wonder. So I didn't really have full access to that. I did an event for a Muslim community group in Brisbane a couple of months ago, and I had that conversation with them. I had to say that was the truth of it. But the rest of it wasn't so bad. I mean, I'm sure I missed out on certain things. I'm sure I missed out on, but I was aware of how lovely certain things sound in Arabic. Like, we have the 1,001 Nights. We call it the 1,001 Nights. And Jorge Luis Borges always said that was the perfect title for any kind of book because, 1,000 is like myriad. It's endless. But it's 1,001. It's like one more. But in Arabic, the title is Aflela wa Layla. That's beautiful. It just rolls off the tongue so beautifully, doesn't it? So I was aware that there were places I couldn't enter because I liked Arabic. I was conscious of that.
I'm going to flip the question and kind of continue to interrogate this a little bit. Like me, English is your first language, and that means that we are inheritors of the Western tradition, right? The history, the assumptions that are built into our world. I was kind of wondering, looking at the books that you have written, you've gone into Constantinople, you have gone into the golden age of the Islamic world. You haven't gone into, early Rome. You certainly have not written about the English monarchy, one of whom is getting crowned, I think, sometime now. You are not delving into kind of what is the Western tradition. I don't think anyone has to delve into their own tradition, but I'm genuinely interested in what interests you? How do you know where you're going to navigate through history?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot lately. I was in New York recently and met, I have an agent over there, and he said to me, "Tell me, is it illegal for you to write about Australia?" And I said, "No. Why haven't you written about Australia?" And I said, like Homer Simpson, "I don't know." I think I'm always outward looking. And in not writing about Western history, Western European history, well, there's a little bit of that here and there in my books. It's not because I don't like it. I love it. I love the Western canon. I grew up on it and I adore it. It's part of the way I think and feel. But I sort of want to go into places I don't know all the time. I'm always, and I try to write like that person, going into a world where I don't know yet. I'm finding out things. I go looking for hidden treasure, and it's not that hard to find if you have the right kind of attitude. There's almost a magical process with that, actually, looking for the stories. It's a strange and very, very odd thing about how that works. You have to ask stories to come to you in a certain way. It's a really odd thing They're like sort of shy kangaroos or something like that. So it's more about, I want to go to places I don't know about. In my head, I've got a big sort of, quarter completed jigsaw of world history, I think. And I'm always seeking to put new pieces of that jigsaw in place so I can see how they connect. And it's a wonderful observation you made about my books talk to each other. Yes, Iceland is in every single one of my books. Constantinople is in every single one of my books. I haven't got Prague into all of them yet, but Prague does make an appearance in here once. So I like that idea that that the world is connected and you can sort of set things alongside each other. But I'm an outsider looking in most of the time.
I do have a question about Australia, believe it or not. For those of you who haven't yet read the Book of Rose and Kingdoms, Australia gets a mention, and I was not expecting this. In 1979, 5 coins with Arabic inscriptions were found, which makes them the oldest foreign objects found in Australia. And that really, you've only got like, what, a page and a half in there, but that challenges a lot of contemporary Australian understanding.
It does. This is a story that's, well, one point you can start, this is where I chose to start, was in, I think it's 1944, during World War II. There was an Australian airman on an island just off the coast of the Northern Territory, just off Arnhem Land. He was posted there to man a radar station to look for incoming Japanese aircraft. He was fishing on the beach one day, saw something in the sand and got a handful of little old coins out. And they looked interesting. He put them in a matchbox, brought them home to Sydney with him, forgot all about them. Then he found them again in 1979, took them to the Coin Museum, such as it was then. And they said, 3 of those coins, they're from the Dutch East India Company. That's not remarkable. But those other coins there, they're from Kilwa. Now, Kilwa was a medieval Islamic kingdom on the east coast of Africa, somewhere near Zanzibar. It's still there today. There's a kind of a ruined palace there. It was one of a chain of Islamic, they were kind of like mini Singapores, if you like, along the east coast of Africa, African Islamic states that became fabulously rich in the Middle Ages and made their own coins. So how the hell did these coins fetch up in the Northern Territory? And we don't know, of course. But of course, what we do know is that Arabic dhows, Muslim dhows, where ships were going, following the monsoonal currents, weather patterns, and going down from Basra out of Iraq, then going down past Saudi Arabia, down the east coast of Africa, down past Zimbabwe, where they collected gold and slaves and timber and all kinds of other goods. And they also went round the other way, down past India, going down to the island of Serendip, which was their name for Sri Lanka, which is where we get the word serendipity from, then looping through the Moluccas around near Singapore, and then shooting up to Guangzhou, where they had a whole part of the city of Guangzhou, a whole Muslim quarter of the city devoted to traders there. So, and more they're finding shipwrecks of these dhows, of Muslim dhows, that were coming back from China, from Guangzhou. They hit a storm, they got blown off course, they got sunk. There's been one found in Belitung in Indonesia, which has been found with these vast cargo loads of Chinese porcelain on their way back to Baghdad, or indeed down to Kilwa, where the walls of the palace were sort of covered in plates of Chinese porcelain, which shows you what this world was like. So in one sense, it's a shock that these coins should show up, probably by some mariner who got blown way off course and landed on this island just off the coast of Australia. But it shows you the reach that these coins, Muslim coins, have been found in Australia, and they're also in burial sites in the north of Scandinavia, in Viking graves from Varangians who went and fought for the armies of the emperor in Constantinople.
Richard, if your New York publisher gets his way or gets their way, maybe that's how you start your first book about Australia, with that story.
Well, no, I won't repeat myself, but looks like I'm bringing Australia into my next book, but it won't be centered in Australia. I'm still figuring that one out.
I'm going to come back to that, but before we talk about what you might do next, I wanted to really interrogate a few more of the individuals that you write about. Now, this is a work that does include many great historical figures, or many well-known historical figures. There is Charlemagne, there is Genghis Khan, But one of the people that stuck out for me, and I'm going to not say his name correctly, is Mark Orelstein.
Ah, yes.
Yes, and I ask about him because he was born in 1862 in Budapest to Hungarian Jewish parents, and like so many people of his time, he basically stole parts of history in a misguided attempt to preserve it. And as you are meeting all of these people who kind of changed history in their own way, or changed how we now catalog and find history, how do you approach like coming across a guy like that in history?
One thing I do to begin with, first of all, is to be forgiving of chauvinism. And I know we're all supposed to scold chauvinism, but people are that way. They just are. And the Arabs of Baghdad were like that. They thought they were like the Americans of the 20th century and the British in the 19th century. That God had granted them this fabulous empire. There's manifest destiny. They had the best ideas, the most money. They were the most cultured, the most literate people. And God surely intended it that way because they were the best people. They knew they were the best people. They even had like racial pseudoscience. They had this idea that brown people were perfect. It's kind of like getting the toast just right, you know. It's like people, an academic called, a scholar called Al-Jahiz said, those Northern Europeans, they're pale, they haven't been in the womb long enough, they're stupid, they live like savages, they deserve our pity. What do you say about those Europeans? Ugh, yuck, ugh. People in Africa, they're too hot, their skins have been burnt by the sun, it's too hot to get anything done there. But us people living in the middle climb of the earth, the brown people, we're the best. And because the climate is the best, and it's no coincidence that all the great cities of the world are in this climb, this line of latitude. So there's chauvinism in all the cultures I write about that. But it is important, I think, as an historian, you've got to break free of that chauvinism. I mean, while you forgive it to some degree at the same time. So Mark Orelstein was a really interesting guy to write about. He was, it's hard to describe very briefly about how he fits into one of the narratives. He plugs into a narrative I have from a traveller called Salam the Interpreter, who was commissioned by the Caliph to go and look for the wall of Gog and Magog, which is the wall that holds the apocalypse beasts behind it. We've got Gog and Magog in the arcade here, in the Royal Arcade here in Melbourne. It's been part of Christian mythology, Muslim mythology, Jewish mythology, and he was sent out to see if it was still intact. And it seems it's possible. I don't know if you could say it's plausible or possible, not certain, but I think it's possible he went beyond the Taklamakan Desert and ended up in the westernmost reaches of the Great Wall of China, the Han Dynasty Great Wall of China. You think what a journey like that is like. At the same time, so then you fast forward to the very early 20th century, and there are scholar, archaeologists, adventurers who were going into Central Asia. And Mark Orelstein was one of them. He was a man, like the Caliph who sent out Salam the Interpreter, obsessed with the legend of Alexander the Great. This whole chapter is really, Alexander the Great is the inspiring figure behind all of them. And which young man in the British Empire couldn't read the exploits of Alexander the Great and want to follow in his footsteps? This extraordinary man who conquered the world in his 30s, cut the Gordian knot, did all these extraordinary things. And Orelstein wanted to follow in his footsteps. He was fascinated by the intersection of ancient Greek, ancient Greek art, Buddhist philosophy, and Chinese aesthetics, which took place in Central Asia in the early Middle Ages and produced these beautiful, splendid Buddha statues that we see today. And while he was around that end of the Taklamakan Desert, near a little town called Dunhuang, he heard about the 1,000 Buddha caves. Now, this is near, I don't think it's quite in Xinjiang, I think it's in Gansu province, the 1,000 Buddha caves. It's right out to the west of China, right the point where it hits the Taklamakan Desert, Central Asia. This is this rabbit warren of caves that's been carved out for over the period of 1,000 years by Buddhist pilgrims going from China down to India. And they, to improve your karma, you create Buddhist statues, create Buddhist art, and write Buddhist scriptures. And bit by bit, these caves near Dunhuang filled with these stunning statues and frescoes on the wall. And it is today the world's greatest repository of Buddhist art. It's an extraordinary place. He'd heard about this. He wanted to see it. It wasn't really his field of study, but he wanted to see it. But while he was there, he heard that the monk who was looking after it had found a secret cave. The monk who was looking after the Thousand Buddha Caves had seen like a little crack in the wall and got the workmen to take it away and found a secret cave. They called it the Library Cave. And in it were scrolls and banners and silk banners and works of art and letters that were 1,000 years old, and in some cases 1,500 years old, that had been perfectly preserved in total darkness and total desert dryness. And he knew the value. He ripped off the guardian. He paid him a horseshoe of silver for the lion's share of the letters and books and scrolls and stuff that's inside, and he brought it back to Britain, thinking his justification was, I have now taken this out of obscurity, I've brought it out of danger, and to be fair, this stuff was in danger at the time, and I've brought it to the British Museum where it can be kept safe and all of humankind can enjoy it. The Chinese don't feel the same way about this, as you may imagine. And today, I've been in the British Library. You can go to the British Library and see the world's oldest printed book. It's not a Gutenberg Bible. It's a scroll of one of the lectures of the Buddha that was taken from the cave. And it's there on display in the British Library. Now, to some extent, this stuff should go back to China, I think. I think it absolutely should. I don't want to wag my finger too much at Orlstein. Yes, there was a bit of sharp dealing there with that. He's acting by the values of his time. You mustn't be guilty writing history of presentism, imposing our values on people in the past. But what damage has been done by the taking of these priceless documents can one day perhaps be repaired by returning them to China and returning them to their place. But there was a real great crime here that was irreparable. And that was by an American archaeologist, what's his name? Langdon Warner, who is the basis of Indiana Jones. Steven Spielberg based Indiana Jones on this American archaeologist who showed up at the Thousand Buddha Caves in the 1920s and was there as an art historian to see the Buddhist frescoes. And he was horrified by what he saw because Muslims in the area were outraged by it. Some Muslims had defaced it or painted over some of the frescoes. And even worse, some white Russian soldiers had been camping out in the Thousand Buddha Caves and like painting graffiti over it. And he said, this is terrible. I have to remove them from the walls and bring them to Harvard. So using a chemical agent, he peeled up something like 12 frescoes off the walls. He botched some of them, irreparably damaging them. And they hang in the Fabled Museum in Harvard today. I was in Harvard just a couple of months ago. I went to see them, but the museum was closed, which is such a shame. But really, when has it ever been okay to do that? I mean, at the end of it, I came to the view that those frescoes would have been better off taking their chances inside the cave than to be peeled off the walls like that and hung in a cold museum somewhere.
You have looked at at history from so many different angles, and I'm interested on a personal level, Richard, what bits or who from history pops up in your mind? Who can't you let go?
There's a few people. One is Constantine XI, the last of the Roman emperors, the very last Roman emperor. I know we all think, those who've done a bit of Roman history think it's the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus, the last boy emperor in Italy who was sort of chased off his throne by a barbarian chieftain. No, he wasn't the last Roman emperor, because the Roman Empire in the East continued for another 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The later Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire based in Constantinople, which is now the city of Istanbul, endured for another 1,000 years after that. The very last Roman emperor was a man named Constantine XI, and it was he who was charged with defending the city against the army of the Ottoman Turks. And his story is so incredibly poignant and weird and so sad and beautiful. It never fails to move me. I find his defense incredibly heroic in the truest sense, in that it was so doomed, but he felt he had to do it nonetheless. It should be noted that the city of Constantinople at the time was a wreck. And the people who really destroyed Constantinople were not the Ottoman Turks. It was the Fourth Crusade. A group of Venetian, very, very cynical Venetians and French and Italian knights who were supposed to go off and take the Holy Land back for Christ. Instead, they never got there. They ended up sacking Constantinople, stealing its riches, breaking the city. They were total bogans. They didn't know how to run this great imperial city. They ran it into the ground, so it was merely a shell of itself. And this is what Constantine XI had to defend. The story of his last hours is so dramatic and so poignant, I will never forget it, never.
That's a beautiful answer, Richard. We're going to go to questions in a few minutes. So if you have any questions, there will be a microphone for you to ask Richard. While you're thinking about your questions, Richard, I'd like to ask you to reflect on your 4 books that we have sitting here. I see a progression through them.
Oh, you do?
I do, but I want to know what you see through them. And if I can be so bold to put a very big generalization out there, the first 2 books that you wrote are very personal. There's a lot of you, the man, you, the father, you, the friend in those books. And the second 2, there's a little bit less of you in the third, and there's almost nothing of you in the fourth. So looking at your body of work and the one that you're working on or thinking about now, how do you conceptualize your own contribution to history?
Oh, I don't know if I see myself as having a contribution. I mean, I think one of the things that people said afterwards that I'd come up with something with my first book that was fairly original in the sense that it combined history with travel memoir and mythology.
It's absolutely stunning.
Oh, thank you. That's kind. And it is very personal. It does talk about fatherhood, the kind of powerful feelings I have about that. The second one is my adventure with my friend Kari Gislason, my Icelandic Australian friend, my Viking friend, our adventure we had around Iceland, our 2 visits there and our journey into the great sagas of Iceland. So yes, that's quite personal. Although Kari's story is really at the heart of that, I think. His personal story is at the heart of that book. The third book, The Golden Maze, is my history of Prague. That's personal, very personal for me. In fact, in a way, that was, in some ways, my most emotional book, actually, to write. It was hardest to write, the hardest to write easily, because that came out of my experience of being in Prague in the Velvet Revolution period. When, in that period, in 1990, when all those Central and Eastern European Stalinist police states overthrew their wretched governments and brought sort of peace, freedom, and democracy to their countries. I was there in Prague. I saw it happen. It's one of the most moving experiences of my whole life. I love that place. It was profoundly strange to me when I went there at the time because there was almost nothing in English and very few people spoke it at all. It was still like a very communist place, even though the communists had just been overthrown. I go back there every chance I get. Now I have some of my best friends who live there. I feel very, very powerfully about that place. And that's the first time I think I've written modern history too, was to write that history of Prague. This was the book. Normally I like to go somewhere and have an adventure and then write about that adventure and plug that into the history. But I couldn't travel. I couldn't have that adventure.
The pandemic?
The pandemic. So this was the book about travelers for me when I couldn't travel. So that was born out of necessity more than anything, I think, Astrid. I don't know. I think I would have loved to have put, I suppose, more of myself into this, but it just didn't feel like it fit this time. I was just sort of standing outside of it and hoping what my presence is, if I have a presence in this book, as I hope I'm able to infect readers with my excitement about finding these stories, my love for the material, my sense of the fabulousness and weirdness of this civilization, and the sheer pleasure it brought me to find this stuff.
Are there any questions?
No, hang on. What's your progression? You said, was that the progression about me not being less and less in the book? Was that the progression you thought you saw it had?
That is the progression.
Right.
And I would add to that I feel this is totally, I don't know how you're going to react to this. I feel like you are more in command of what you want to share. And you are bringing something that the majority of people who buy books written in English in Australia aren't expecting and probably wouldn't pick up if you didn't do it.
Oh.
I think that's really beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I like to think that too, actually. I like to think that too. This is stuff, all my books, in my prologue to all my books, I say, I can't believe no one's heard about this stuff, or nor me, before I found out about it. Yeah.
but you have a unique way of finding stories, Richard.
Yeah.
Are there any questions for Richard? Yes, we have one over here in the back. A microphone will come to you.
Hello.
Hi. Thanks so much for the book. I really enjoyed. I don't know. There was parts of it I found pretty challenging, but I was interested. It's a bit of a potted history, and I couldn't tell whether you'd chosen particular stories that stood out for you, or there was some other way you put all those things together. And I think at the end, particularly with that really intense sexual violence, and then the stories of the 1001 Nights that were sort of tacked on to the rest of it, I couldn't really put that together. I'm just interested. I kind of felt like you had that interviewer's eye of all these personalities that you're interested in. Maybe you'd love to, talk to them. And I suppose my question in that is, which is the one you'd most like to interview, because there were some amazing characters.
In terms of just to go to your point about structure, the book works like this. The first bit is trying to be quite holistic. I felt I had to explain how Islam and the empire came into the world, how it came out of a group of squabbling Bedouin tribes who were suddenly united, suddenly in command of this new faith, and very suddenly in command of this gigantic empire. So that's the first part of the book. And then the next four are the traveller's stories. So they're not meant to be holistic at all, although I am following the historical arc. So that's why they're placed where they are, is that the major journeys in each of those travellers, north, south, east and west, happen in chronological order, which is why the Viking human sacrifice is the north one is the final one, because it's the latest of those stories. And then the final chapter is the destruction of Baghdad, the end of the Abbasid Empire by the armies of the Mongol Khan, the Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan. And then I felt I didn't want to end it with that. I wanted to end it with description similarly to Ghost Empire, which is this city is destroyed. The idea of the city is destroyed, but it remains as an immortal city of the imagination. And because almost the moment, the very same period when Imperial Baghdad was destroyed, and almost nothing at all remains of Imperial Baghdad from this period. So thorough was the destruction by the Mongol armies. It was around this time that the 1001 Nights, as a body of stories, which had come from India and Persia, and had sort of congealed, if you like, or come together in the Abbasid Empire, had finally formed a kind of a proper finished whole in the booksellers of Cairo. And so it was around about this, the stories of Imperial Baghdad now exist in all of our imaginations. All of us in this room got those pictures in our head, even if they're corny and cartoony, of people on flying carpets and Aladdin and genies and what have you, out of lamps and what have you. But all those pictures, all of us right now can look in our mind's eye and see a glamorized image of Imperial Baghdad, can't we? We can, all of us, do that in this room. So that, and this came into the world, and Baghdad became immortal. At the same time, it was totally and utterly destroyed. So that's why I framed that. Who would I want to interview? I don't know. I've got no idea. I mean, I felt like I was interviewing them all, a lot of these scholars already, just because they constantly speak their mind about things all the time. And the question I want to ask, they're already sort of answering as they're talking to me. So I don't know if there is one person I would want to interview, though, it would have been Al-Masudi, who gave the potion for invisibility at the start, just because he knew so much. I've traveled a lot, but nothing like that guy, and not by those means. By camel, by horse, by ship, by cart, all those things, by walking. I'd love to have met him, love to just ask him a couple of questions and let him rattle on, and the less I would say, the better, I think.
Is there another question for Richard? Yes? We have one here, and then directly afterwards.
Hello.
Hi. Richard, I'm curious about how you juggle when you're researching and writing a book, how you juggle that with your radio commitments, because it's obvious from the interviews that you do a lot of research pre-interview. You don't go into them cold. How do you, is it easy to compartmentalise off parts of your brain that, just push the book aside while you're researching someone quite deeply?
It was during the process of writing this book that I realised and I never thought this would ever happen to me, that I've become a workaholic. I don't know what to do about it, quite frankly. I work nearly every day. So I work 4 days a week on Conversations, and thanks to the great Sarah Konoski, who does Thursdays and Fridays on the show, that allows me to spend work part-time. So I work Monday to Thursday on Conversations and Friday, Saturday, Sunday on writing books. And at some point I just took a week off to recently so I could go away in a little place to be on my own and write or try and nut out what the next book is going to be. And I do that every once in a while. I just sort of try and squish it in at the margins. I was just mentioning earlier that I wrote a lot of Ghost Empire on the bus on the way into the ABC on an iPad, just because sometimes, I don't know why, so long as the bus driver isn't playing FM radio, you know, I can't write if I've got, it's the eye of the tiger, it's the fat rising up. I can't do that. Although I do have an app on my iPad now that's called Noisely. It puts white noise in my ear so I can not have to listen to that. Or even worse, the dickhead on the bus who's doing a business meeting on his phone. Yeah, get Cheryl to tic-tac back to you on that one. Nah, tell him to piss off. Nah. Oh, God. Really, can we all agree you should be quiet on a bus, please? For my sake. You want me to write more books? Don't do business meetings on the bus, please. So that's how I do it. That's how I do it, Mr. I'm also in a fortunate, my kids are grown up. They're 23 and 20 now. Son's moved out, daughter's still with us, but you know, she's happy to look after herself. I don't need to be taking the kids out for fun on weekends anymore. So I just work really hard, I think. Yeah.
Thanks.
We had another question here in the middle. If you could put your hand up just again so the microphone could find you.
Oh, it's just over there. Hello.
Thank you, Richard. I have to sort of quote a few things from your book.
Oh dear.
Your sense of the absurd is quite impressive.
Thank you.
At times, but it's to do with that. I hope you can hear me with this and read a book at the same time.
Which book have you got there? Is that Ghost Empire? Is it?
Sorry?
Which book have you got there?
The latest one.
All right, Book of Roads and Kingdoms.
I haven't got a cover on it.
Right, okay.
Sorry. The geographer and map maker Ibn Hakwal
Yep.
went to Palmyra
Yes.
and made some comments which made me feel a bit more you were bringing it into the current century.
Yes, you're right. I know exactly what you mean.
I'll just read out the passage here. He was appalled.
Hokal, who was an Arabic traveller who arrived in Sicily and went to Palermo. He'd been all over the world, all over the known world, and got to Sicily and he hated it.
Yes, he was appalled to see that the locals eating raw onions. This seemingly unseemly habit he spined had thwarted their imagination, impaired their minds, numbed their senses, altered their thinking, clouded their understanding, and even ruined their facial features. I just got thrown back into a few years back in our politics.
Well, in response to that, I can say as an ABC impartial presenter who has no political opinions whatsoever, I don't know what you're talking about at all, sir. I deny all contemporary relevance for that phrase about how eating onions deranges the mind and disfigures the face and makes one completely unseemly to their fellow human beings and unworthy of being in their company. I can't see any possible contemporary relevance for that whatsoever, sir.
Thank you, but I did enjoy that bit. Thank you.
Well said. Is there a final question here? We have a question down the front.
We've got a mic.
My daughter has been studying the latest book, this book, all this year and having a fantastic time with it.
Oh, thank you.
And I grab it in between her lessons, so I haven't quite finished it. But we also read Constantinople first, and that was so fascinating. We started on the Prague because I'm fascinated by Prague, but after a while we had to stop because I didn't know enough about Balkan history to sort of work out what was going. Have you got any suggestions of what she could study to fill in that to set the scene for?
Oh, well, I was hoping the book would do that itself. I tried to be as clear as I could with that. Yes, there is it's a thing in the introduction to The Golden Maze, my book of Prague, where I quote the great Czech writer Milan Kundera, who wrote The Unbearable Lightness of Being and the Book of Laughter and Forgetting, who he thought that one of the reasons why the Czechs were sort of thrown to Hitler, thrown to the wolves of the Nazis in 1938 at the Munich Agreement was because the Western democracies, Britain and France, just couldn't sympathise with the Czech people because the language holds Czech and other Slavic people at such a distance. He called it, we were separated by, the Czechs were alienated from the West by our strange and scarcely accessible language, was his phrase for that. I certainly noticed that when I first arrived in Prague in 1989. I just couldn't understand a word of what I was seeing around me. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book, because the city was like a fascinating, incredibly beautiful stranger, because it is the most beautiful city in the world, Prague. It's magical, it's extraordinary. I had to sort of immerse myself in it as well. But there's no getting around it sometimes. There really isn't. I avoided using the diacritical marks because Czech words are often further alienated from English readers because they've got like a little banana or a dot or an accent here and there. You know, still today, most people call the founding democratic president of the modern Czech Republic, they still call him Václav Havel when you pronounce it Václav, because the C is pronounced as a ts sound in Czech, unless it's got a banana on top, and that makes it a ch. So, and who knows that? Hardly any people know that. So I was always working with that. But I hope after a while those names sort of fall away, and you just use the maps, I suppose, that I've got to see Prague as this city which lives up to its name, which is a threshold. Prague is taken from the Czech word Prah, which means threshold. And it is one of the great thresholds of Europe, which is why the Nazis came through there, the Russians came through there, empire after empire has claimed it for itself, which is the tragedy and the glory of its history. So I just suppose, I really just wanted people to hold the idea in mind that Bohemia is special, it's made up of different people, and it sits right in the center of Europe. That's, yeah, that's the best I can do, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Perhaps we'll have another
have another red hot go.
crack at it,
Or just skip forward to the 20th century part, because that's where it really kicks into gear.
because this one at the beginning was so many names. I thought, I can't remember any of this. And once I got past that and into Mesopotamia and everything that was going on, it just didn't matter. You could remember the names.
Yeah, I'm conscious of that. I'm conscious of those things. The harder thing was Sagaland, actually, because all those Viking names. And the bloody sagas, they never work in threes. Like there's always four, and they've all got the same bloody name. Like the beginning of Gisli's saga, you've got four blood brothers. You've got Thorgrim, Thorkel, Thordis. And Thordis is the wife of Thorgrim, and she's the sister of Gisli, who is the blood brother of Thorkel. And it's like, oh, Christ. Oh, Jesus, Kari, can we do something about that, man? And that was really hard with radio. So I did this thing with the radio version where I said, there are four blood brothers, Thorgrim, blah, blah, blah. And I said, you don't need to remember their names. Just know that things are about to go wrong between these blood brothers. So you have to just do that. Don't worry too much about the names.
Yeah, thank you.
We are almost out of time. I'm going to take the liberty of asking you a question that you may choose not to answer, Richard. Can you give us a heads up of what you think you might work on next, without ruining the details, but maybe a time period or a geographic location or something broad to whet our appetite?
It's going to be a compendium of the greatest disco songs of Boney M, I think.
Fair enough.
You know, no, it's probably going to be somewhere in the Pacific, actually, in the Pacific. And it'll probably have quite a bit to do with Singapore. So my wife's from Singapore, migrated here in 1973 with her family when the White Australia policy finally came to an end. She was 9 at the time, but her family story in Singapore is really extraordinary. And I might bring it into my family story as well. It's still being nutted out in my head. But I'm not saying definitely no to the Boney M book, I'm afraid.
Understandable. Could we have a round of applause for Richard Fidler?
Thank you. And for Astrid, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Richard and Astrid, for a wonderful conversation. Richard, you said there are some places we cannot go, but in your storytelling, you have been a magnificent guide to some fascinating pages in history that I'm sure many of us would otherwise not know about. So thank you so much for your storytelling, your gift of writing. In a few minutes, you can have your book signed at the signing table, which is at the back of the room. And if you'd like to purchase a book, Northern Books are ready to assist you.
And I should just also say that in medieval Baghdad, the tradition was to buy 5 copies of a book. I'm not saying you've got to do that, but it's kind of rude if you don't. That's all I'm saying.
They are very well stocked. And also a reminder that all of Richard's titles, as well as collected recordings from conversations, are available now in the Vision Australia Library. So if you're interested in learning more about the library, please speak to one of our team tonight. I mentioned earlier that Vision Australia has recently taken a bold step in sharing the stories of our community with the wider Australian audience. Earlier in the year, we were thrilled to launch our Big Vision picture book series. This is a series of picture books for children which feature the stories of Australians who are blind or living with low vision and doing amazing things in our community. Our first book in the series is called Surfing in the Dark. It features Matt Formston, who is a blind Paralympian and surfer who is recently catching big waves in Navarre, Portugal. And Richard, he would be a fascinating conversations subject. We'll have a further 2 titles released later in the year featuring Craig Shanahan, who's a chef, and fashion designer Nikki Hind. These beautifully produced books, they're published by Burbet Publishing, are also brailled, and they're the first commercially available book in Australia with print and braille in the same edition. That's something we're really, really proud of, but it's also something that's long overdue in Australian publishing. So we're really passionate about representations of disability in literature, and these books are now making their way across schools, libraries and homes in Australia. We do have some copies here tonight, so I really invite you to have a look, have a feel of the braille. They're beautiful books and they're available for purchase tonight as well. Before we let you go, Richard, we do have a little something for you. Our print access team here at Vision Australia has created a tactile version of the book of Roads and Kingdoms.
Wow.
Cover.
Really? Wow.
So the cover has been recreated using UV tactile printing. I might just describe the cover for our members who are listening online. The Book of Roads and Kingdoms has a beautiful geometric pattern that radiates from the centre of the page, kind of a feathered design, with the printed title, The Book of Roads and Kingdom, overlaid across the top. So this has been reproduced in a tactile version. It's also brailled as well. So that's just something to thank you for joining us.
So delighted
tonight.
by this. This is the most wonderful gift. This is the best gift I've ever had from doing a book of it. I'm not kidding. This is sensational. Thank you. How lovely. Thank you very much. Oh yeah, sorry, there we go. Right. The title's here in Braille as well. It's wonderful. They're fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So thank you again, Astrid and Richard, and all of you for being here with us tonight, joining us in person or online with the Vision Australia Library. We farewell our guests who have joined us via the live stream, and we look forward to having you with us again in conversation in the future. Thank you.